Legislative leaders say they're working on a way out of the state's budget woes that will be a bipartisan solution. Is it a grand bargain or a grand illusion? Find out next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, where we talk about the state of Illinois government and how it just might affect your life. Joining me this week is Andy Maloney, writer with the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin, who covers state government. Welcome, Andy.
Good to be here.
And also Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at University of Illinois, Springfield. Well, folks, the big news, as always, seems to be what's going on with the state budget. And what we've had in the last few weeks is, most folks mostly know, is the two Senate leaders, John Cornyn on the Democratic side and Christine Radogno on the Republican side, talking about some sort of solution out of the state's budget woes after 2 years without a state budget. Will it be successful? Or what sorts of things are looking good? What sort of things might be pitfalls? Andy, what do you think?
Well, we've seen the leaders and basically I think anyone else who wants to chime in on this so far urge plenty of caution. There's a lot of stuff in there. You're talking about an income tax increase. You're talking about borrowing billions of dollars to pay back on old bills. You're talking about a school funding formula fix, minimum wage. So there's a lot of stuff in there. And just a little bit of perspective. I mean, I haven't been around as long as either of you guys watching this stuff, but if all of this were somehow included in a package that ended up working, that would be the most sort of significant legislation I'd seen move in all of my years here combined. Now, it's not many years, but it would be pretty significant. There's no doubt. But like I said, it seems like they're urging caution. This is sort of a starting place. I believe the Senate President's spokesman said, we want to get this out there, have people look at it, and we'll negotiate later this month. So there's still a lot of moving pieces here.
Viewers might notice that we at Capitol View are trying to do our part in lieu of in addition to our regular beverage, we have our sugary beverage today. And there is talk now of a one penny per ounce tax on sugary beverages to balance the state's budget. That's 60 cents then sitting right here on the table. Charlie Wheeler, can we big gulp our way out of this mess?
Well, not all by itself, and I suppose I'm a good person to talk about it because I would not be affected. I'm diabetic, so I can't drink sugary beverages. And the definitions contained within the bill, and the sugary beverage is one section of a bill that's 277 pages long, defines caloric sweeteners and non-caloric sweeteners. Caloric sweeteners are basically sugar, fructose, glucose, all of the things that end in OSE, so to speak. Non-caloric sweeteners are things like aspartame or the other chemicals that are put into Pepsi or Coke or Mountain Dew in lieu of sugars so that it tastes sweet, but it has no calories. So there's no impact on people who are trying to lose weight or people who are diabetic. So diet stuff would not be affected. Is it going to raise a lot of money? The estimate from the legislature's fiscal gurus, the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, they assume that in a full year it would bring in about $560 million. When you look at the fact that our current backlog of bills is around $11 billion, at that rate it would take, 22 years to bring it down. So yeah, it's not a big deal. And I suppose people who would be affected by it could go ahead and say, well, I'm not going to buy Pepsi, I'm going to buy Diet Pepsi and not pay that extra 60 cents a can.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, there's more to this than just soda pop. We're also talking about increasing the income tax from 3.75% to, I believe it's 4.95%.
4.95 for individuals,
yeah. 0.05% less than what it was back when the temporary tax increase was enacted and fell by the wayside a couple of years back. In terms of a 5.95% income tax increase, this is coming while state tax revenue is kind of falling off. I think we were down through the first half of this fiscal year by something in excess of 6%. The income tax collections have been falling, and notably also cigarette tax revenue, among other things, has been falling. The sin tax has not been as reliable as it perhaps might have been in the past. With this sort of thing in mind, is now a good time to be increasing the income tax when tax revenues are already falling under 3.75%? What do you think, Andy?
Well, if you're a lawmaker, it's almost never a good time, seemingly, to increase a tax. It's never a popular vote. It doesn't play well with a lot of folks because they're thinking about it in terms of their own sort of spending and income abilities. I think plenty of people will remember having their taxes raised recently and hearing their lawmakers talk about how it was temporary and the state was in sort of crisis mode, and this is something that had to be done, and don't worry, it's gonna end soon. Well, we've seen it end soon, and as you point out, the collections have been down. I believe the forecasting, the COGFA report on that suggested part of that might still be due to phasing out that old tax increase, but as you said, they're still down. And I think if I'm just a citizen who kind of checks in and out of this stuff, I'm going to think, well, you just raised my taxes. Why are we going to try and do it again? So it's always going to be unpopular, but we do have sort of a real financial problem, as Charlie can probably speak to a lot better than I can. So it'll never be politically popular, but I think a lot of sides will admit, if they're being candid, that this is something that needs to happen at some point if we're going to get our way out of this mess.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier about this grand bargain. Is it a grand illusion? Well, to me, the significance isn't in the dollars, the so many pennies per ounce, or how many percentage points or fractions of a percentage point the income tax might be raised for individuals and for corporations, any of the other things. To me, the main significance is the fact that Senate President John Cullerton, a Democrat, Senate Minority Leader Christine Radogno, a Republican, stood side by side before a podium and said, we have presented this framework. This is something that we, Republican and Democrat, are putting forward. And the fact that the proposal, if you want to call it that, or this package of bills includes things that we have to do, in my judgment, to take care of our budget situation, most specifically raising the income tax, and lesser to borrow the money, as Andy suggested, to pay off the old bills. Because guess what? You can borrow the money at the interest rate at which you borrow the money is less than the interest rate that you pay to your creditors who you can't pay for the lack of the dollars. So we have the Republicans coming out and saying, at least the Senate Republican leader, and I assume she would not have done it without the support of a majority of her caucus, saying, yes, we're going to have to raise taxes. You have Senator Cullerton putting forward changes in workers' compensation, which the business community says don't go far enough, but at least they are there, and there's a commitment to it. There's a commitment to a 2-year property tax freeze, which is one of the items that the governor wanted. So in that sense, the partisan leaders have both embraced some of the ideas that have been associated with the other side of the aisle. And to me, that's a step forward. Now, will the final package look like this? No, there'll be changes, there'll be tweaks all along the way. As a matter of fact, none of these ideas can pass independently the way the bills are structured now. Every bill says that this doesn't become effective until these other bills in the package also become effective. So it's all or nothing. It's either, as it stands now, the whole package or none. You don't get to pick and choose. That'll change over time.
Right. Well, I mean, there's also perhaps, no one would call him an elephant, but we've got Mike Madigan, who's a Democratic donkey. He hasn't been part of this. What do we make of that? I mean, is this DOA? Is this, how can we reach any kind of a grand bargain, a grand compromise, when Mike Madigan hasn't apparently been part of this?
Well, and neither has Governor Rauner, in the sense that at least he says he's not been part of it. And the leadership, Radogno and her people, Cullerton and his people, say, no, we haven't consulted with anybody else. This is a Senate effort to move the ball forward. And the governor will weigh in along the way. Should the package go to the House, the Speaker will have to weigh in on it. But I think the longer we go without resolving this problem, the worse it becomes. And if you're looking ahead to the 2018 election, it's certainly not to the governor's advantage to say, I've been governor for 4 years and damn, I couldn't get a budget passed. You know, that doesn't make him look like
how does that play out here?
Yeah, I suppose in one sense it could, but on the other hand, and the reason I couldn't do it is because we have this all-powerful Wizard of Oz out there in the House who blocks everything, and I can't figure out how to get around him. And in the bottom line, I think both of these guys kind of have to step back and say, here's what I'd like, and this other guy is trashing it, or here's what I'd like, and this other guy is trashing me, and say, okay, for the good of the people of Illinois, we look at how our social services safety net is collapsing. We look at how our higher education is suffering. For the good of the people of Illinois, I'm going to put my own personal ego aside and say, okay, let's move forward.
Okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
I was just going to add to Charlie's point. I think the House and Speaker Madigan made some points on that during the inauguration. You had an interesting piece talking about some of the things that the leaders said during the inauguration, saying we need to move forward, and there are things that all of us agree on, even though they've been bitter. But I think observing both of those, there was sort of this sense in the Senate that everybody was at least on the outside, sort of on the same page and getting that message out there. Governor Rauner was there presiding over that inauguration, complimented President Cullerton on his extraordinary leadership. In the meantime, you had this contentious vote for Speaker in the House. You've had the Speaker who is the subject of a lot of campaign-style political attacks over the years, and even though he came out and said, there are some things that we can agree on, there was still a whole lot of hubbub about how political and contentious it was. So you have some chambers that I think, in my opinion and observation at least, have struck some different tones so far. That doesn't mean it can't change in the House, but I think they're on a different step as it stands now.
Well, at least in theory, the governor is in charge of presenting a budget. I mean, that's supposed to be the starting point. We all know that in Illinois that hasn't really been the way that it works.
Roughly a month or so, he has to present one for FY18, which starts on July 1st.
If this ain't soup, what should he do when he has to present his budget message? Should he go along with tradition and present something that everybody knows is DOA, or should he come up with something concrete that's real?
Well, he has yet to pass a budget that is truly balanced in the sense that a few years back we passed a law saying a governor's budget proposal has to be based on existing law. He can't take into account, he can't take into account cuts that he's going to make in spending, or he can't take into account revenues that haven't been generated yet. And the governor did that in his first budget. In his second budget, he said flat out, this is out of balance, and you can either enact all of these things I want you to, or you can give me power to cut it as I see fit. And so that one, as you say, was DOA, and that's part of the reason why why we are where we are.
One thing that I'm wondering about, among other things, is for going back some time, there's always been two things that have been talked about in income, which now is entirely exempt. You don't pay any income tax on retirement income, no matter how much it is. The second thing is a tax on services, extending the tax to auto mechanics, to beauty salons, to lawyers, to doctors. Services remain entirely untaxed, and that puts Illinois in somewhat of a minority when it comes to the rest of the country. Why aren't we hearing talk anymore about those things, or is that something are those cows so sacred that they're just never going to be gored, so to speak?
It's a really interesting question. We saw during the campaign the governor came out and talked about taxing some of those services that you mentioned, but it didn't end up going anywhere. Now, each of those industries, the attorneys, computer programmers, whoever is getting their service tax, obviously they're not going to like it. They're not going to like that they're getting hit with a tax, that other services were excluded from those types of proposals. perhaps it's one of those things that didn't play well with the business interests that the governor has. He's talked about making Illinois much more business friendly. But it's difficult to do those types of things, and especially when you're talking about retirement income. We've had all this talk in the last few years about changing pensions, and we've seen sort of the reaction from workers and retirees and the unions who represent them. So it's really hard to get a lot of the ball moving on that type of stuff. And as you say, Illinois is an outlier, but we also have this a much stronger sort of guarantee of pension benefits for people. And so I think perhaps any sort of attempt to take that away is met with stiff opposition.
Although if you were to impose a tax on retirement income or expand the taxable income base to include retirement income, and you included all retirement income, there'd be no problem with the pension clause, because you wouldn't be diminishing the benefit any more than when someone who's collecting in my case, should I retire, I hope I'll get a state university retirement system pension. When I go in and buy a loaf of bread at Schnucks and pay the local sales tax on it, that doesn't diminish my benefit. It's how I choose to spend the benefit. Yeah. So I think you could tax retirement income.
Sure.
If you had the political will to do it.
Sure, and particularly, it's never been talked about, I think, by most folks, as we're going to tax all retirement income. We'll exempt the first $50,000. So if you have $50,000 in retirement income, you still pay no taxes. If you make $60,000, you pay no taxes on the first $50,000. You pay taxes only on the $10,000. Can that in any way be used in any sort of a wedge issue to say, hey, folks, I mean, they want to raise your income tax, back up to 5%, but here are all these folks, they can be millionaires and they pay no income tax at all.
The difficulty with that would be you couldn't tax income that someone derives from investments or dividends, those kinds of things, even once they've retired. You could tax whatever they get as a pension, be it a government pension, be it a private pension, be it Social Security.
IRAs, that sort of thing.
Yeah. But you couldn't structure it without changing the Constitution so that you can get at income itself above a certain level, which is one of the proposals. Mike Madigan has said that income in excess of $1 million, I believe it is, should be taxed at a graduated rate, a higher rate, sort of like the federal system.
Speaking of Mr. Madigan, in the Senate they've enacted rules that enact term limits on Senate leadership. What are they trying to? Why did they do that? Are they sending a signal to the House where Mr. Madigan has been under some criticism by his critics of, geez, you've been, that's too long. Why would they have enacted that, and what sort of signal might it send to the other chamber?
Well, I think we saw some of this idea, term limit for leaders, get some currency in previous sessions. Some members had introduced constitutional amendments to enact term limits, and some of them were for all members, some of them were just at leadership. I think there was a general will to curtail, at least among some constituencies that some members represent, to curtail the power of legislative leaders, because they see in sometimes an exaggerated caricature of what the leaders can do. Sometimes they have genuine disagreements with them. But in this case, they went ahead and approved a rule change that says the Senate leaders can't serve in those positions for more than 10 years. And the vote happened without opposition. It was 58-0 in the Senate. So this is something that they can roll it back if they want to in the future, much easier than a law or a constitutional amendment. But this is perhaps an overture to negotiating in good faith during this grand bargain. Obviously, Governor Rauner has called for term limits quite a bit, and his call for term limits is aimed mostly at the Speaker, as you indicate there. But it was a popular idea, at least in this limited form in the Senate. And so I don't know if the Speaker feels pressure now to take up some kind of vote on that. I don't know that he will. Personally, it's hard to see the Speaker rolling out a term limits rule even and saying, well, let's take a vote on this and see what happens, because his members just stood up on Inauguration Day and basically gave him a vote of confidence. And so if you come back all of a sudden and then vote to limit leaders, even though it might not affect the Speaker in 10 years if he's still around here, it could be seen as a sort of repudiation of his leadership.
Well, I mean, I think also...
And to me, that's the problem, is as a practical matter, my guess is that 10 years from now, Mike Madigan probably won't be Speaker. 10 years from now, Madigan will be awaiting his 85th birthday in April. And so him staying on for that length of time, I would guess that the odds are probably against it. But for him to concede the point now, a lot of his own personal pride has to be in it, because he knows that the second he concedes, Rauner's minions will be all over him with these attack ads and, oh, we forced the king to step down, and all this nonsense that just totally pollutes the political discourse. It just brings it right through the cesspool. Yeah. And if Madigan were sure that, yes, I'll make this gesture, and it would be seen as, okay, I'm responding to the concerns of constituents, I don't think it's a good idea, but I'll do it. And if it would be Rauner saying, I agree, I think that's a good idea, and not like rubbing salt into the wound, I think it'd be easier to do. But in this environment, any little gesture you make is going to be interpreted as a sign of weakness, and that you're bowing down to Rauner, who would like to be king.
And let's be clear, any kind of a vote to limit the term of the House Speaker cannot go to a vote unless who says so? Madigan, correct?
As a practical matter, yeah. I mean, if I forget what, I believe it's like 3/5 of the House votes to do anything, they can change the existing rules. If 3/5 of the House were behind it, they could enact a similar rule. But yeah, Democrats aren't going to back or buck Madigan, particularly after they've voted for him for Speaker, despite the fact that Rauner's operatives were harassing them. As a matter of fact, the Speaker had no more taken his oath of office than the Republican Party apparatus blasted out all these emails. You know, Representative Rushton betrayed his constituents. He voted for Mike Madigan. The only way we'll get a change is we have to get rid of people like Rushton. And then the next one said, Representative Wheeler betrayed his constituents. They're all identical. They just changed the name of the person. I mean, it was, in a sense, it was kind of sophomoric, and it's the kind of stuff that makes it hard to get things done when you're constantly doing this schoolyard taunting and bullying instead of behaving like responsible adults. But maybe that's what we've come to these days.
Yeah. Well, tomorrow is Inauguration Day in another city, Washington, D.C. Donald Trump will be sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. Bruce Rushton has said he will not be in attendance. I believe something like 30% of Democratic Congress folks will not be in attendance either. By not going to the inauguration, does that have any kind of effect on Illinois? What's the potential for that, if any, to either negatively or positively affect Illinois? Any thoughts?
I think as a practical matter, as president, Trump could exert some control over federal dollars, perhaps in an indirect way coming into Illinois. But if he's really seriously upset at, say, Governor Rauner for not showing up to his inauguration, I think if he wanted to, the worst he could do to him is show up in Illinois and sort of make it politically difficult for him to escape Democrats using both of those names in the same sentence. I don't get the sense, I guess, at least now, that that'll be a big thing that Trump will pursue, at least right off the bat. I think he'll have a lot of other things to get acquainted with when he takes the oath of office. It's something to keep in mind, though, if the next president decides to visit the land of Lincoln.
Well, certainly he's got a thick skin, so that's
sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say exactly that point. Most people would figure, okay, he's doing it for whatever reason. I understand that. call the story about George Ryan in the midterm. After he was elected governor, he was not all that popular, and so he would tell legislative candidates, Republicans, he'd say, "I'll campaign for you or I'll campaign against you, whichever will help you the most." And so that's kind of the sophisticated political way of playing it. But with Trump, you have a guy who is very thin-skinned and who takes umbrage at just about anything, and so he may decide to go after Illinois. On the other hand, he seems to have a short attention span, so maybe he'll tweet something at 3 o'clock in the morning and then forget about us.
I mean, we are known as a blue state. Does that bode, I mean, is there any danger there at all? Andy, either one. I mean, is Trump going to punish states that didn't go his way? Is that something that might be in his makeup?
Well, I think he could come out and conceivably make, say, sanctuary cities a big issue. He could put that back on the agenda and start talking about how, with his immigration plans and the wall and all of that stuff, a city like Chicago has tons of problems. He could also sort of continue to drag that city through the mud in terms of crime rates, because that'll still be in the news regardless of whether crime rates go up or down in that city. And as Charlie says, he has been known to respond to sort of any kind of political slight, but I do think he might have some other things coming at him a little bit faster once he takes the oath of office. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe some people said that during the campaign and it never panned out that way. But it's hard to make a specific prediction on that, I guess, at this point.
Well, I would say to the extent that he can do anything, it would be on the types of infrastructure improvement projects for Illinois. Federal programs cover everybody. So if he decides Illinois is a blue state, so I'm going to punish him by doing away with Medicaid. Well, there are a lot of people in...
No, he said he'd give insurance to everybody, but go ahead.
Well, but what I'm saying is if he cuts back on programs, the programs aren't Illinois specific, other than,
Sure.
as I say, like what used to be called pork barrel highways or bridges.
Well, we got in line first for high-speed rail under Obama, for example.
Yeah, but if he decides to cut some of the broader programs, it's going to hurt people in red states too, because not everybody in a red state is a multimillionaire TV star like Donald Trump. There are a lot of average citizens, some of whom actually rely on those programs like Social Security and Medicare.
Sure. Okay, well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and so thanks again for joining us, Andy and Charlie, and good evening to you from Capitol View.